Um, Peter, I came in a couple minutes late. Have you been introduced?
No.
Okay. Should I try to do it based off of memory from our talk yesterday? Um, so Peter Szatmari is a clinician scientist at CAMH and Sick Kids, and until recently was chief of the collaborative at Sick Kids and CAMH and the Division of Child and Youth Mental Health. He started his career, or at least built his career in autism research, and that's an area of international expertise for him, and has expanded into research in depression and models of care and measurement-based care through his role as director of the Kundal Center for Child and Youth Depression at CAMH. Personally, I count him as a mentor. We have been co-leading a project together for the last few years now. That's been a real learning opportunity for me, and delighted to have him here today. Welcome, Peter.
Thank you, Nikki. That's very kind of you. Yes, our project together has been a lot of fun. Danica, do you want to do the slides? I have to apologize to everybody. I can't do my own slides when I get all confused with the presentation mode and this, that, and the other thing. So Danica has graciously agreed to do the slides for me. This is a new talk for me, building your research team. I haven't done this talk before, so I would really like some feedback, and I would like also a lot of interaction between us. Don't interrupt. Make your comments. I can't see everybody, Nikki, so maybe if you see somebody put their hand up or something, but people should feel
Sure.
comfortable just shouting out and saying something, because this is there aren't a lot of slides on this. So there's lots of time for conversation. And I see too that there are both very senior and some early career researchers together. So I would love the input of everybody on some of these comments and thoughts. The next slide. So I don't think there's any argument at all that the way science is being done these days has changed, and certainly it's changed enormously since I started as an early career researcher. The days of the Lone Ranger in biomedical research are fading, if not completely gone. And I think it's becoming apparent that it's more and more important to work. And I'm going to emphasize this point, at least in part, not completely, but at least in part. And I think everybody, how much one works in teams is an individual choice and depending on one's field. But everybody, I think, benefits from working as a member of a team. And I think the field makes better advances as a result of teamwork. And it's never too early to start developing a team and working with colleagues. And I'll give some what I found to be practical tips about how to build your research team. So what I'm going to talk about today is, while I'm very keen on teamwork as a role in science, we need to also consider the costs and challenges to teamwork, so that if we go into it with eyes open. Also, some really interesting research that I'm going to talk about the consequences of team science, and has the nature of science changed as larger and larger teams are doing work in a field. I'll talk about some principles of team building that I found quite helpful, talk about the ingredients of a strong team, and then I'll finish off with what I hope are some words of wisdom, if not folly. Next slide. So I have worked as a member of a team right from the very beginning. The It's hard to, that's not a misprint, everybody. So my first experience of working in a team was in 1983, where I worked on the Ontario Child Health Study at McMaster. This was a fantastic experience. I love this. The Ontario Child Health Study was an epidemiologic study of mental disorders in children 4 to 17 years of age in the province of Ontario. Dan Offord, who was my mentor, was the PI on the grant. And this was an interesting team. It was a large team. Um, we would meet every Friday afternoon. And Dan, who was a camp director, ran this team like he was a camp counselor, right? So he'd sit at the head of the table and, we'd talk about sports. First of all, it was always about sports. And then we'd get into the business, and it was every Friday afternoon, 3 to 5. And it was just so much fun to be together. It was such a long time ago. I remember the professor of social work opening the window and smoking. Can you remember? You don't know this, but people used to smoke in offices. So Jack Biles, who was a professor of social work, was lovely, and he'd open the window and he'd have a few butts over the course of the afternoon meeting. It was a very homogeneous team. So virtually all psychiatrists, a couple of nurses, and one social worker. So a very homogeneous team. In the 1990s, I worked on the Autism Genome Project, and this was an experience. So this was 175 scientists from around the world, and this was a very fun project. It was supported by a foundation, which allowed us to kind of get together. It took a long time to work together and to work out some of the difficulties, but you can imagine trying to corral 175, I'm going to call them cats instead of scientists, because that's what it felt like, from around the globe was a challenge. But I learned an enormous amount, and it was great fun. And I met all kinds of interesting people that I still call friends today. And, our new chief of the Child and Youth Mental Health Collaborative, Louise Gallagher, that's how I met Louise. She was a junior member of the Autism Genome Project. So these connections that you make in teams, even though the team may end, the collaborations and the relationships go on, and can very often be very rewarding. Probably the most important research project in my life has been the Pathways in ASD study. So we started we got together and started to think about the project in the late 1990s. We got funded in the early 2000s, and that study's still going on. So that's one team, virtually the same people over a 23-year period. And I've learned a lot about teams for that. And, you can imagine were many opportunities for conflict over a 23 period, people coming and going, but that's been a very instructive and a very rewarding team. When I came to Toronto, I got involved in other teams, our Youth Can Impact trial, which was a multi-site clinical trial here in Toronto, the TAY cohort study at CAMH. Now I'm quite involved in the Canadian Health Survey of Children and Youth. So this is a Canada-wide epidemiologic survey of health, more than 50 scientists all across the country. We have this new opportunity called CALM. I can't remember what CALM stands for, but it's funded by the Ontario Brain Institute on mental health, multimorbidity in children and youth. And, each of these teams that I've worked on is unique in terms of their context and their objectives and their team composition. And there is a developmental progression in how these teams have come together and what they constitute, et cetera, over time. So a lot of my research career, my life, my professional life has been as a member of a team. I'm not a very social person. I have social anxiety. My wife tells me I don't have good social skills. And so you can be a good member of a team, even though you may not be all that comfortable in working with a large group of people. Next slide. Science has really changed. And there's an interesting editorial in Nature from this year um, pointing out that, the Higgs boson paper that was so important a couple of years ago, that had over 5,000 authors on it. Imagine 5,000 authors. Um, this editorial points out that the number of papers with more than 1,000 authors has surged in recent years. The average number of authors per paper has risen from 3.8 in 2007 to 4.5 in 2011. And I know for sure it continues to increase over the last decade. And there is, in fact, quite a bit of scholarship on team science and what pushes it and what the benefits are and what the challenges are. But there's fairly good agreement that this increase in team size is due to a number of different factors. As scientific activities become more and more specialized, you need to get larger and larger teams to deal with these specializations. You know, a communication technology has changed considerably. It's so much easier to communicate with people. I can't believe that virtual meetings like we have today have completely replaced the conference call, which is how we used to do our team meetings in the past if they weren't in person. Probably the most important is that uh, the complexity of the problems that people are dealing with really require interdisciplinary solutions, and I think that's an increasing recognition that no one discipline can. Of course, nobody can solve a biomedical health problem or answer a question. Nobody can get at the truth. I don't believe that. But you make incremental progress and it becomes more and more complex, and that does require interdisciplinary solutions. And then, of course, there are more and more health professionals who are engaged in research than there were a decade or 2 decades ago, and that must lead to an increase in team size as well. Next slide. So, I have extolled the benefits of working on a team. Um, Scientific progress, certainly, according to the literature, does seem to be facilitated by multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary teams tackling a process. It's also incredibly rewarding to work as a member of a team, but there are costs to it. And I don't want to shy away from the costs and the challenges to collaboration. Uh, Communication and coordination costs, and I'm talking fiscal costs, really become important. So it's expensive to have team meetings on a regular basis. I think in-person meetings are really important for brainstorming in particular, and so you have to bring people together at least once a year. I think, in my experience, that works reasonably well. So you need funding for that, either from a foundation. The Autism Genome Project was supported by a charity, and that paid for bringing people together, which was great. You may have a team, and often the goals of the team are not aligned, and that may only become apparent as time goes on. You may not realize that not everybody is singing from the same hymn book on the member of a team, and that can lead to problems. Sometimes communication is difficult because team members from different disciplines lack a common language and a set of experiences. I remember, again, on being on some teams where the technical expertise was so sophisticated, like in the Autism Genome Project, these molecular biologists, I didn't have a clue of what they were talking about. And so I just had to go with the flow, kind of keep my mouth shut, and just hope that that we were going in the right direction. Um, Translation may be a cost, an extra cost in developing some of these global teams. And then you need to develop a whole set of processes and routines so that the work can be distributed and synchronized and progress can be monitored. And that takes a lot of effort from the team, the sort of the sub team or the principal investigator that's leading the team. So it's a lot of effort. It's a lot of work to lead a team, managing people, maintaining the hardware and software, communicating with co-authors, updating funding agencies via reports. All this falls on the head of a laboratory scientist and draws her away from actual research and her own research. And then on top of that, to say nothing about the legal issues and material transfer agreements and contracts that need to be developed. Oh my goodness, that can take an awfully long time, especially if, in my experience, these days, legal teams in hospital are being cut back and they're really stressed in terms of the amount of work that they have to do. Next slide. And it is true that team science does not always lead to better science. And I found this paper uh, recently in Nature really interesting, comparing large teams and small teams. So this paper analyzed more than 65 million papers, patents, and software products that span the period 1954 to 2014. Imagine that, 65 million papers. And they compared small teams versus large teams. And the conclusion was that smaller teams tended to disrupt science and technology with new ideas and opportunities, and they would succeed further into the future. So if they succeed, the success lasts longer. The impact is longer if it's a small team that disrupts science. So a new idea, a turn in a new direction, something that's really, really innovative, that's easier to do with a small team. Larger teams, on the other hand, tend to develop existing ideas and build upon more recent developments. So larger teams are more incremental. These authors conclude that larger teams are more incremental and smaller teams are more disruptive. And so it's not always true that larger teams are better. It depends on the state of the field. Um, and The authors conclude that we need both large teams and small teams to ensure that we have I love this, a flourishing ecology of science and technology, and that we need to support both a diversity of team sizes. I can really see this. I can really see how working on a large team is an exercise in compromise. You have so many voices around the table that it's very difficult to think outside the box and to persuade your colleagues to go along with you outside the box and be disruptive and really innovative. It's much easier to be incremental and slower. And the editorial that accompanied this paper makes the point, well, where are we now? Are we in a is our field more incremental, or are we ready and ripe for disruption? It's a very interesting problem. Certainly in mental health, is our field in an incremental stage, do you think? Or is there something that you think that's out there that could be really disruptive? Next slide. Um, so these are, this is a great document which you can get off the internet. It's called the Collaboration and Team Science Field Guide. It's from these authors. It's from the National Cancer Institute. And this document really talks about teams, and they sort of these are what they summarize as the top 10 takeaways of a successful team. And trust is most important. Team members have to trust each other, and I think they have to like each other as well. The team needs to have a clear vision. This is something not that's not always done in when you're building a team together, but to make sure, and the vision's different from the grant application, because the grant application is a project. It's not a vision. So it's really worthwhile to spend time in your team on articulating and agreeing on what the vision is. A team needs clear and strong leadership. Somebody needs to take the helm. I've been on teams where we rotate team leadership, so it's not always one person all the time. Uh, but sometimes, the nominated PI is the team leader, and then that's fine. Being a part of a team takes self-awareness. It takes emotional intelligence. You have to be empathic. You have to appreciate where other people are coming from, what's important to them. When you're making decisions, you need to compromise all the time. This can be really difficult, compromising, and but it's important, and you need emotional intelligence and self-awareness to compromise. Sure, I'll come to that in a second, Susie, about structure. Mentoring is important. So it's, I think, important to have teams with different levels of seniority, and that there are both junior and senior investigators on the team, and that, excuse me, and that the senior investigators have a role in mentoring not only their own junior investigators that they bring along to be part of this team, but also play a mentoring role to other people at other sites in the team and in the collaboration. Communication's really important. I have been on a lot of teams where I've been a part of the grant application, but then they forget about me. So I'm part of the grant application, and then the grant is successful, and then a very small group of investigators carry out the project, and I've got no clue what's happening. And to me, I get very cross with that kind of team, because it's really tokenistic in terms of, you used me to get the grant. I want to be part of the communication. I want to be part of what's happening. I want to be an author on some of the papers. It's really important to communicate with people in a formal, regular, structured way. And there are different ways of doing it nowadays. It can be, face to face. It can be virtual. It can be a newsletter. We've done that. So different ways of communicating, and it's important to have a suite of documents too that are records of communication things, because people's memory is terrible, especially if they're in a if they're if there was a conflictual agreement or a conflictual point, people's memory of that will be not very good. And so you need to refer to that a written document to clarify and resolve disagreements, conflict resolution. Teams change over time. People come and go. This is a, this is a fact about teams, regardless of their size or when they start, and that's okay. And you need a formal process for introducing new people into the team and for saying goodbye to people who leave the team. And that's fine. And the dynamics of the team will change as new people come. And the team needs to be flexible enough. The leader, in particular, needs to be flexible enough for that to happen. The next one's really important because it involves authorship, recognition, and sharing success. Um, it's very important to have a very clear policy about authorship and about presentations and who's going to do it. And it can't be a small group at the top. It has to be shared with everybody. It have to be clear rules about who's going to be the first author, who's going to be the second author, who's going to be the senior author. How is that going to work? Different projects might have um, different rules about that. But again, having a written document that outlines authorship and allowing recognition to occur is really important. Navigating and leveraging networks and systems is really important. So, there are different teams out there in the ecosystem, and these different teams may be working on the same project. These teams will be competing with each other. So, but it's important to know what's happening with these other teams, to maybe work together. This is also something that can be quite challenging, is bringing two teams together for a common purpose. And then you've got to start sort of all over again. And conflict is inevitable. And there needs to be a clear process that's documented about how to resolve conflict, how to manage disagreement. People have to be respectful. Nobody can monopolize the conversation. You can't say, can't get emotional, under any circumstances. You have to manage these kinds of things. Again, this needs to be clear. The leadership team needs to demonstrate this in real time. And sometimes it's good to I've done this a couple of times, created conflict in order to practice with the team how to manage conflict and how to handle it in one way or another.
Peter,
Yeah.
can you say more about that last point?
I mean about
Creating a conflict.
Yeah. So creating a conflict. So let's say there's a decision about research design. Oh, I know. One of the most common conflicts in our field is what measurement tool to use. Everybody has their same measurement, their favorite measurement tool, and they're really wedded to them especially if they've published it. Because if the team gets to use your favorite measurement tool, then your citation index goes up and your H index goes up, and et cetera, et cetera. So I would sometime mischievously, suggest a particular measurement tool that wasn't great, but that I had worked on, just to see how people would handle me putting this forward. So that might be something. Or the allocation of money. Now, I wouldn't do this on purpose, but the allocation of funds can also be a real source of disagreement. How does each site you're not going to get enough money because teams are expensive. So this is always a problem. Teams, there's a lot of in-kind contribution to working on a team. So the allocation of funds from the research budget to a site is often a problem, and needs to be managed carefully. So, and the way to do it is to have your values up front. The way to manage the agreement is to always be true to your vision, always be true to the values of the team working together. You know, um, we're going to share, we're going to support early career investigators, we're going to be sensitive to equity, diversity, and inclusiveness. We're going to, you know, it's important to articulate one's values as a team so that you can always refer to those values when you're trying to make a decision. Um, Another value is win-win. Is yes, I'm going to ask you to compromise, but although you may compromise now, we will remember that you compromised so that you win the next time a decision comes around, so that it's shared over time, the allocation of resources or any kinds of decisions. The leader has to have a good memory as to who compromised and how we can make it up to that person when a later decision comes around. Susie, you asked about um, a structure where the lead rotates. So every team needs to have a governance document as to who, so often there's a steering committee or an executive committee, and then there's the larger group of investigators. You might have an international advisory board. You may have, a child and family caregiver, um, people with lived experience who are advising as well. But this steering committee, you can elect the chair of the steering committee, and you can agree that every year you're going to rotate. And I've never voted, but there's always been agreement as to who wants to take on the leadership of the steering committee or other committees that are around. We always have a publication and dissemination committee, and in the pathway study where we've been going for 20 years, we rotate the leadership of those committees, and somebody always volunteers. Somebody's always, if it's a good team and people enjoy working, then somebody will step up to the plate and volunteer to take leadership after somebody steps down. And you could have a rule, we're going to change leadership every year, every 2 years, whatever seems to work for the life of the grant. Susie,
What kind of size of group would you be thinking about in that kind of situation where you've got a larger executive committee? I've got, say, one project that I'm leading where there's myself and a co-PI. We have our very small group of people who are really doing most of the work. We have a larger group, but the small group of people is not such that we need to, there's only 3 of us. So but when you're thinking, I'm assuming you're sort of thinking here, like kind of multi-site intervention kinds of trials. I mean, I can see the advantage depending on how big something's getting, particularly around having a, publication and dissemination group, so that the person who's steering all the other admin parts of the project isn't also trying to keep track of where are all of our publications at. But is it sort of, what kind of sizes would you be thinking about in kind of creating that sort of structure?
So I would recommend against a small group of the steering committee being composed of a small group of people who have worked closely together for many years. That I would rotate in and out not only that small group, but people from the larger group that you may not know as well, because the engagement of everybody is absolutely essential for the completion of the tasks and the activities. People have to feel that they belong to a team, and they'll only feel that they belong to a team if they're asked to step up and be part of some leadership opportunity. So I think being inclusive is another value that one may want to articulate. So I wouldn't have cliques. You see what I'm saying? You have to worry about cliques and silos. You want as much inclusiveness as possible, and rotating people in and off is a good way to just get everybody involved and everybody engaged. You'll find that to be quite helpful when it comes time to read papers, because the biggest slowdown in in team activity is getting everybody to read the paper and put their comments into the paper, and however you do it, it just takes a long time. Everybody's got to read the paper. You can't be an author unless you read the paper and you make comments. So that can take a long time, and people will do that if they feel engaged and that there's an expectation for them. That's another thing that would go. I'm going to talk about this sort of memorandum of understanding, where a lot of these principles are outlined in a moment.
Great.
Danica, next slide, please. Yeah, okay, there we go. So one thing that I found really helpful is to have what we call a memorandum of understanding. And I don't know if other people have done this, but and I don't know where this comes from, frankly, but we did it first for the Autism Genome Project, and then it was so useful managing 175 scientists that I have done this for larger teams more recently. So a memorandum of understanding is an organic document. It can change over time, and it lays out the rules of engagement of a team. And every team member has to sign it. This is important. They have to sign it, so it's an agreement. And it's the memorandum of understanding has a number of different parts. It's an outline of the team's values and its vision. It formalizes the governance of the team, some kind of mechanism for conflict resolution. It's a way of keeping team members involved and creating expectations. As team members come and go, this document is part of the institutional history of the team, so that new members of the team can feel part of the team quickly because they know what is expected and what's passed before, so that they have a sense of the history of the team and its values. They're not sort of being they may not have been there at the beginning, but they can participate in it. And as I said, the biggest sources of conflict is the allocation of funds and authorship and intellectual territory. Not intellectual property. What I mean by intellectual territory is, well, I'm interested in, the prevalence and correlates of depression in children and youth. Well, there may be another member of the team who's also interested in the prevalence and correlates of depression in youth. And so how are we going to decide who's going to take the lead on that particular project? So there needs to be a process for that kind of understanding, and a document that's that's there, and it's a living document too, because it can change over time. So we would review the memorandum of understanding every year. So we could say, is there anything that needs to be updated? Anything that we would change, anything that we would delete, anything that hasn't worked, anything that we should add, et cetera, et cetera. So at our annual meeting, the team would have an opportunity to review the MOU and make any changes as time went on. I'm interested in if anybody else has had one of these memorandum of understandings and when they've worked on a team. Arun, Mary Jane, have you ever had one of these?
Yeah, I have with Ontario work. Anything I've done in partnership with or I was involved in very large cancer genetics teams, and some of those were international, and we had something similar. And we also, as you said, we reviewed it every year. It's actually very helpful when the teams get big like that, and especially, and also when they're national or international, not local.
Yeah.
I must confess, I don't have anything standardized with my team in this respect, but I always strongly encourage and keep reminding the members that they should bring up any kind of unhappiness, grievances, and not hold it back, but in an appropriate way at the appropriate time.
Yeah. And and there is something that's added extra, I find, Arun, I don't know, by writing it down and having people sign it. You know, that gives it some solemnity, which I think is important.
I fully agree, and I shall consider starting to practice it.
Yeah. Especially around authorship, like some of the grantmanship or authorship disputes that can happen down the road, how you're going to list a large team, who's going to be first, even when you're listing a big working group. And yeah,
It
As
can be
presentations.
As they say, good fences make good neighbors.
yes, that's true. And that's why a publication committee, I find to be in your team, can be really helpful, because the publication committee, you know, has a view of what everybody wants to do. They can decide, well, this, you know, this is pretty similar to what Peter and Nikki wrote about or are planning on doing. One thing that can happen is that, for example, Nikki and I may start on an analysis plan, and then as we get to know the data, we change the analysis plan without telling anybody. And then that can become a problem if the publication committee is not aware of our change, because somebody else may want to do a similar kind of thing. So here's where, you know, communicating with the publication committee is really important. And I find the easiest way to deal with authorship is to support early career researchers and to say, you know what, priority will be given to early career researchers to be first author on the paper. And for other people, depending on their expertise, to be second or senior author. And that seems to have worked reasonably well.
I've been involved in a situation where, again, it was international, and we had a publication committee as well. So that was a subgroup of the big, larger one. And we actually had to, and then we had a psychological group within a bigger, very big interdisciplinary team. But we still, for publications, I think we had to submit the title and an abstract of what we were planning. And in that case, I believe we even, yes, we needed, it was a colorectal cancer team, and I was running all the psychiatry part, psychological part, and we still needed approval, no matter who was going to write a paper. You had to submit an abstract and a title, and I believe even the authors, and it had to be approved. And I think it was to do with what you're saying. It wasn't just that they want to control everything that's published. They wanted to make sure that the, you know, people in one country knew what somebody else might be doing, or which part of the data they were going to analyze and write up, because it was so big to manage. You know, it was a team over 10 years as well.
Yeah, that's right. So so these things can be quite helpful. Okay, next slide. So this is the headings of a memorandum of understanding that we're using in the CHESY, the 2023 CHESY, Canadian Health Survey of Children and Youth. And these are the different headings and sort of what goes into it, and the kinds of things that we thought were important to include. Consequences, that's something. You know what? If you know, consequence, just make it clear. You know what? If we don't hear from you on your feedback on the paper, you won't be an author. Or, you know, if you don't show up for X number of meetings per year, we'll have to reconsider your membership. So having consequences for lack of participation in the team is important to have that overt. So again, it's transparent. Everybody understands that you have to attend meetings. You have to be, you have to respond to email requests. You have to read the papers, etc. And if you don't, then you won't be included in the future. And then I think this is important. Teams end, and it can be a difficult process emotionally. So there needs to be a process for how you decide that the team's going to end, what happens, who is left with the data, the resources, the biobank, the papers, et cetera, et cetera. These things need to be considered as you can see that the team is being sunset. But like many relationships, teams end, and so one needs to plan for that. Next slide. Okay, so this is really important. Who do you want to be part of your team? I have a couple of points to make about this. That the most important is to have a vision of what the research program is. And I talked about this before. There's a difference between the research program and a project. This is a team works on a vision for a research program. And a program will be made up of multiple projects. There'll be multiple projects that are part of a research program. And every team member has to have a role and how does that team member fit into the vision of the research program? And it's worthwhile reflecting yourself about the skills that you have, what skills you want to learn in the future, so that you'll be able to contribute in this way to the team, and what skills you need to incorporate via team members to make the vision a reality. So it's worthwhile as you're thinking about developing a team is what are your skills and what are the skills you want to bring into the team, first of all. It is so important to like the people that are part of the team, to actually like them. I have been on teams with people I don't like. I know it's hard. It's hard for us to admit we don't like people sometimes, but there are people I don't like, and it's really not fun. You're going to work with this person for a long period of time. It's important to like them. So make sure you like the people and you're having fun with the people. And not everybody needs to contribute equally, as long as there's transparency about that. Some people, maybe what we call a collaborator as opposed to a co-investigator, or somebody just maybe a content expert on a small part and only called in for that part. So we don't need to think of everybody being engaged in the same way over time. That this can change as long as it's transparent and everybody agrees that that's what's happening. And again, diversity, equity, and inclusiveness are so important. So, I look back on the 1983, the Ontario Child Health Study. That was not a diverse team. We were all the same. And that, I think, limited. So you really want people with different skills and background, geographic location and perspectives, including really authentic patient engagement. So I think people with lived experience now should be part of every research team and authentic members of the team. They don't have to, be part of, the regular meetings all the time, but they should be, their roles should be clearly specified. and that, we have to ensure that all team members can contribute according to their skills and their wishes. And again, make sure they have the opportunity to be included from the beginning to the end of the program. And I just raise this because a number of times I've been part of teams and I've been forgotten, even though I think I have something to contribute. And that leads to a bad feeling at the end. Next slide. So how do you assemble a team? So bits of advice: it's never too early. It takes a while. Never too early to start building a team. As you got to put aside your social anxiety. And one of the things I think, going to conferences, of course, you're going to know colleagues in your own setting, in your own city, etc. But I've emphasized the importance of geographical diversity in your team makeup. And that's really useful. First of all, it's great to get people from outside the University of Toronto so that you can see not everybody does things like the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Toronto does. It's good to know how other people are doing things. So I go to 2 conferences a year. I go to one conference in child and youth mental health, and then I go to a conference that's outside my field. So when I was into the genetics of autism, I'd go to the American Society of Human Genetics, or I would go to the American Epidemiologic Society. It's really important to, I think, go to conferences that are outside your field, not in mental health. And this is the way to meet people that might be interested in your area, but from a different discipline and a different perspective. When I go to a conference, I focus on posters more than papers. So I would specifically request to do a poster because I want people to come around and talk to me. Or if I go to a conference, I spend more time at the posters than I do at the papers because I get a chance to talk to people and meet people, find out if they would be congenial collaborators on a particular topic, if they have a skill set that I think I need for my team. And you know what? It's okay to cold call or cold email scientists whose work you admire. Even though you've never met them at a conference or you don't have a personal connection with them, it's totally legit to email somebody and say, look, I really like that paper you published in XY. I really think that work is really cool. I'm interested in this. I can see how your work has an impact on that. I don't know, Mary Jane, Arun, Nikki, I love getting emails completely out of the blue from people who have read my work and are interested in it. That gives you an opportunity to develop a relationship. It takes years to cultivate a relationship with people to be a member of your team. Being on an examination committee, great way to connect with people in adjacent fields. Absolutely true. I'll put that down for sure. Start with the network that your mentor has, right? One of the important things that Mary Jane has emphasized is the importance of using your mentor's network in order to make connections for yourself. And that's a good place to start. And grant review panels are also a great way to meet people and to socialize. So that's been really helpful. And again, a lot of fun.
Peter,
Yeah.
can I ask a question? Because
Sure.
it's not all that easy for people to do cold calls and reach out and even go up to kind of a giant or even a mid-level giant at a conference. But let me ask you this. Do you feel that if you're going to pitch yourself to somebody as a collaborator or co-investigator or something, or you want somebody on your team and you want to lead a grant, I guess for me, I don't know if this is what I always did. I think I did. I offered something. Like, I mean, And sometimes and even in Toronto, sometimes with cancer genetics people, I offered to even do their clinical assessments or even see some of their patients. I know that's another level, but you know what I mean? Like I feel, I wondered about that, like going to a conference and you want somebody maybe to join your team in your mid-level or even junior. Do you need to, like, you're making it sound like most people would be happy to help. Maybe they would, but I mean, do you have any thoughts about, sometimes I find the two-way street thing really helpful for my relationships, but I just wondered what you've done or others.
Yeah, that's a good point. And again, that's the idea of a win-win situation. I would never, because it's so important to me to like people and to get to know them a little bit. You know, I might cold call somebody, but I wouldn't ask them to be part of my team after that first meeting. I try and develop a relationship with them, and over time see, well, if you were to be part of my team, what can I do for you that's a win-win? How do you benefit from this? You always, as a leader of a team, you need to have a good theory of mind. You need to know what's motivating other people, what's important to them, and to try and build that into the rewards of being part of your team. But I develop a relationship with people before I invite them to be part of the team.
Okay.
That I know I can work with them, and that it's going to be a worthwhile experience, fun. Again, this thing about being fun is so important, because otherwise it can be such a drag
Yeah.
to do this.
If you are particularly keen to get someone, now with all the social networks in research, you will find a connection to one of your mentors or senior colleagues, and most of them would be quite happy to write an intro email so that you have better chance of getting a positive response.
Yep. No, I think that's absolutely true. And but it's good to have people on your team that are at the same level as you, right? So I wouldn't want to be on it if I were a junior investigator. I wouldn't want to be on a team with all senior investigators. I'd want to have a good number of people at my level, so that we could, so that there'd be more common ground with people. I think there's one more slide left, Danica. Final words. Yep. Working on a team is fun and educational, and it does increase the impact of your work. It'll increase your citation, although I hate citation and I hate H indexes. I don't believe them for one word, but it'll increase your citations for sure. And you know what? Science is a social activity. You are engaged in a conversation with your peers, with journal editors, with funding agencies, with different stakeholders. And, building a team is just another aspect of that social activity. And your research vision's constantly being revised based on these conversations. And shouldn't be surprising that we, especially as mental health professionals and researchers, are constantly engaged in building, maintaining, and dissolving a research team. I just emphasize this concept of compromise and trying to always make win-win decisions, that somebody gets something out of it at some point in time. And again, emphasize that not every activity in your academic plan needs to be done in the context of a team. I think there are things you should do alone. You should write viewpoints alone. You should write commentaries alone. You should offer to write editorials alone, so that you can carve out a space where your own brand is out there, and people are getting to know what your own brand might be. So that's the end. Yeah, please fill out the evaluation form and give me suggestions of how I can build this talk up and add some other things. I got some great ideas so far. Really helpful.
I really liked the components from the field guide. That was really those are really helpful. Did you have any? Is it just commiseration, or do you have any good advice about managing the contract, subgrants, and legal agreements? Because that is the bane of my existence.
I know.
I have to make an agreement with myself in some cases because I'm in two different locations.
Crazy.
It's bananas. And
I agree.
I like, there's so much of my time is on like administrative things that we don't have anybody else who can manage. And anyways, if you've got
Yeah.
any, or
No.
maybe it's just commiseration. If it's just then
That's commiseration. I mean, the only advice is to make sure there's funding in the grant for a manager to handle those kind of things, so that you're not doing them all the time, so that you can get somebody else to do them. And that's why it's expensive. These teams are expensive.
Yeah.
And you need to think about how to budget creatively for them.
Yeah, I think that's one challenge in a lot of the social sciences and humanities grants. They tend to cut. That's the first thing that you get cut from your grant is a manager that's not a grad student. And then if it's a grad student, you actually just have to do more work to bring them up to speed to be able to do that kind of managing role. So
Yeah.
it tends to be a challenge.
Good point. Good point. Yeah, I mean, here's where philanthropy are it can be helpful, and because they're quite happy to support that kind of infrastructure. If there is a philanthropic organization, a charity that's interested in your work and would be willing to support it, then they'll often provide that kind of program management that can be helpful.
So, Peter, like that was excellent. And you make it sound a little bit easier because you're such a gregarious, pleasant. I mean, I can imagine people love having you on their team, but I was just thinking, and any of you for feedback for Nicole and Arun and I, any of those areas could be fleshed out a lot. Like, we don't all have the social skills, or how do you, it's amazing how much conflicts come up. I mean, this is a talk. I'm so glad you guys did. I'm so glad you did this because, I didn't get this at the beginning of my research career. I think we could all use this because it's really tricky. It's really tricky. And it's one of the reasons sometimes research doesn't get done or teams don't survive, like all the conflict, the authorship, the people that dominate or people disagreeing. Like you made so many points along the way. I'm thinking we could flush out. We do have one coming on leadership, so I think that's going to be important to attend. Like, how do you lead these teams and all these different disciplines and communicate and conflict resolution? That a lot of us aren't, we don't all have these social skills. I'm just saying it's not that easy sometimes, right?
Yeah, and I think particularly as somebody who's early career, it's great and it's really supportive to be a member of a team and kind of learn from that experience. It's harder when you're starting out and aren't as sure of your leadership skills and whatever other reasons. It's harder to lead a team and to be the one kind of making the decisions that can be difficult for people, or yeah. And so I'm wondering, other than actually being a member of a team and learning from that, if there's any other advice you might have. I mean, it's 9:59, but and we're going to have a whole session on leadership. But
I would add newcomers to Canada and students who have arrived from abroad, visiting fellows, to be sort of encouraged and given opportunities to open up.
Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, I would just say, watching if you're an early career researcher, watching another team and how it works is a good way to learn how to do it. So being a member of your mentor's team is quite useful. And I think the other thing is to practice some of these things in small teams. So if you're a team of only 4, well, you can still do a memorandum of understanding. You can still talk about how to manage conflict. So, if you just have a team of 4, you can still do some of these things and learn and practice them in that safer setting, a smaller setting, so that you get experience when you're doing it at a larger in a larger setting. So that would be one bit of advice.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. Okay, well, thanks everyone for attending today. Thank you so much, Peter, for putting so much thought into the talk, and I hope you find other ways to share that wisdom with other audiences.